In this roundtable on coloniality in the city, we bring together perspectives from Germany, Iran, Colombia, Jordan, and Brazil. Rather than focusing on authoritarianism as the political character of a specific regime or country, we examine how authoritarian practices manifest or emerge within liberal democracies, intersecting with various forms of repression, silencing, and persecution in autocratic contexts. We explore the colonial continuities of cities and ask how they relate to the growing wave of authoritarian tendencies worldwide. Together with international colleagues, we discuss how urban protests may serve as counter-strategies to the abuse of power and different manifestations of it. What is comparable? Where are the differences? What can we learn from these multiple perspectives about protests, social movements, and self-organization?
I'm going to hand over to my colleague Hugo. He's going to have a few questions for our panelists, and we are hoping that it's going to be a discussion among them, and then we're going to open up to the people in the room as well.
The idea here is that I will present two questions or two rounds of discussion, and then we open the floor for everyone. The first thing that we would like to talk about here is about your opinion, impressions related to this new authoritarian rise that we are passing through. And by that I mean the way that different governments react to protests or social manifestation, and this could be so-called liberal governments or the more the ones that are more recognized as authoritarian ones, and also this what we are witnessing in the different elections, national elections, the spread of the far right winning in different countries. We had the European elections here. So your impressions about this current context, and more than that, how do you see and which experiences you bring here of counter strategies? How are the struggles in the everyday life of the cities, of urban life? So I would like to hear you about it, your impressions about the current moment, and especially examples and struggles. And first, so I will pass the mic to Firoze Faradin. She is postdoctoral researcher working on gender counter-strategies of authoritarian neoliberalism. She's member of the International Research Group on Authoritarianism and Counter-Strategies, the IRGAC. Firo, I'm happy to have you here, and yes, you can start, please.
It would be hard now to talk about context strategy, at least in the context that I'm coming from and working on about Iran, because as we may know, we are in the recession, repressive mood now, and we had a very important and significant uprising that I would call it a kind of revolution momentum in Iran in 2022. We should admit that this moment passed, but it doesn't mean that, of course, we don't have the street politics in the nationwide protests, but it doesn't mean that we don't have any kind of opposition or counter strategy against authoritarianism. But it is also true that the form of resistance now it's different, and it's become more local in a more, I would say, that prefigurative practices in everyday life. So basically, the resistance back to the ground and more neighborhood, for example, initiative and some collectives, cyber initiatives and so on. But we don't have at the moment any kind of street politics as we had in 2022 on the peak of the uprising. But for example, recently, yes, last week we had elections in Iran that, to my surprise, some of my friends and colleagues in Germany contacted me yesterday and congratulated me because of having a reformist new president that is kind of moderate. And I really got surprised that maybe I have no idea about what's happening in that country. So the level of knowledge about the country is that they really think that there is a reformist, so-called reformist in power. But what is missing in this kind of talking and framings is that actually there was a very affirmative non-contributions or kind of participation in the election this time. So there was a huge no to the regime. At the first round, it was, they announced 40% participation. That is definitely is not the correct number. I think based on this, many of the kind of calculation is around, I think, 30%. And for women's participation, it is less than 20%. And you can imagine what does it mean that just 20% of women kind of participate in the elections. And the second one, of course, is that the same as happening now in France, that some people mobilize and they really kind of, based on the propaganda, decided at the end to go to voting according to the official statistic is around 50%, but again, I would say that it is less than that. But anyhow, I think it was a turning point regarding the, this kind of institutional politics in Iran. And I think it's the saying no has very significant in this election.
Thank you so much, Firo. Now we should I invite Hannah Altair to speak a bit about it. She is political scientist, writer, and researcher based in Amman. In her doctorate in Kassel, she does research in state power and gender citizenship in Jordan, discussing the convergences and contradictions of claiming, resisting, and imagining belonging from a queer and magical Marxist perspective.
Yeah, to bring up a few points. So I do have to say I'm not a researcher of authoritarianism per se, because I look at Jordan through a bit of a different lens, but I do think that these structures of oppression that we're looking at function in Jordan. And when I was reading it, like looking at the questions, I also don't see that it's very neo what's happening in the Jordanian sense. It's more a continuation of colonial structures. And I don't know how familiar everyone is with Jordan, but I mean, some people say Jordan is Britain's most successful colonial project, and it's still ongoing. There has not been any actual decolonization despite formal independence. So I'm going to try to talk a bit about techniques of empire and power, how I see them functioning in Jordan and specifically in Amman. So I actually think it's really important to look at the entanglements of Jordan as a territory, both within the region and the cross-border uprisings, but also systems of oppression and incarceration, but also look at how, especially in Jordan, the European Union and especially Germany, since I talk about Germany because we're in Germany. If we were in the UK, I'd complain about the UK. But so there are these structures, and just to bring up attention, so in the research about the Middle East, people tend to talk about Jordan as if it's this like cute, tame country and boring, nothing ever happens, there's no protests, and this is actually very untrue. But there's, we can say, a government or a king who's very much not a symbolic king, but has actual powers, is the head of the military and the army. And so it's not really a constitutional monarchy, although there is theoretically a constitution in Jordan. And when we look at the cooperation of the EU and the US and Germany in particular, they'll be saying they're promoting democracy in the Middle East by supporting that regime that is actually very oppressive towards the majority of the population that's not part of the elite. And in Jordan, this takes the particular form of historically, so the majority of the population of Jordan is actually not Jordanian, and also these categories are quite problematic because all of the borders in the region aren't even 100 years old, so it doesn't also make sense a lot of the time. But when we're talking about Amman, where I do a lot of research about, let's call it protests generally, so 80% at least of Amman's population is Palestinian, which means that most of the people living currently in Amman have direct family in the West Bank, in 48 Palestine/Israel, and in Gaza, which means that this is a top, and Jordan has the longest border with Israel and the region. And so there's a large population whose actual expression of their political opinions, and if they call for freedom of expression, would be simply put that they want to cross the border. This, of course, is not at all in any way compatible with European politics. So you have the Jordanian regime working as a buffer zone. So when people, and it happens a lot, try to cross that border, that happens not only in up layers of international politics that we see in the news here, that happens throughout the year. People try to cross the border, the people that push them back are the Jordanian border guards. And this, when we're talking about protests, so since October last year, there have been daily and weekly protests in Amman that are being violently oppressed by the police with equipment that comes from Europe, with tear gas that is produced probably in Belgium, the UK, amongst others. It's often really difficult to explain to people that when you're talking about oppression and freedom of expression and protests, the protests that are happening in Jordan, if we took seriously this supposed call for democratization, it's really not compatible with European politics. So one question is, what do we do with that? And the other thing is that there has been the tendency to kind of glorify the protests that were happening in 2011 in the region, in Egypt, but also in Syria and in Jordan as well, although that wasn't so much in the media. And I think it's to go back to this question of these protests that we're seeing now are actually a direct continuation in a way of the protests that we've seen in 2011.
Thank you so much. I think we could hear now Doris. Doris Neres coordinates the IGAC and recently just published this wonderful book, Beyond Molotov's visual handbook on anti-authoritarian strategies. Could you join the conversation by saying some words, not only about the book, but your own visions about those issues?
Our research group is also uses the term authoritarianism, which is maybe not the most specific term, but kind of for us is like a concept to bridge different experiences, no? That maybe like more that also have terms that are more concrete, no? Sometimes too concrete, like Bolsonarism and Trumpism and anarcho-capitalism, and like these very so and this is like also a problem we're dealing with, that we have a very specific view on what is happening on the political level in different places, and at the same time we see like these parallel developments over the world. No? What they do have in common, these different developments, is kind of, I would say, like a brutalization of discourses, of political practices, processes of de-democratization. But that is more like on an institutional level in a way. No? And that is also like this, we can see this in Germany, we can see this in France. Even we don't need Rassemblement for this like kind of weaponized neoliberalism, no? That we have like basically all of that. And that has to do with the crisis of neoliberal capitalism and the like need to impose strategies of accumulation with more coercive means. But then we also have the part which we are maybe a bit like more interested in, which is kind of like the ideological mobilization around authoritarianism, which is like the explicit or the kind of the ideological mechanisms that we could call authoritarian, no? which has to do directly with the topic of the coloniality that brings us here, no? Because what we're actually seeing is, of course, there's like a racist and colonialist and anti-feminist and so on agenda, which is what we would call authoritarian, no? and which I would kind of resume in the way of like, it's really like kind of this stabilization, if we want, of identity. So it's a promise to like stabilize identities and to have like a homogeneous societies, to have very clear lines, like where women are still women and men are men and whites are white, and you know, and whatever, this is no pluralism where everybody lives in the place where he or she should be, and so on and so forth. You know, like this promise, and I think this is only understandable in a world which is like really in crisis, like a world where it's so difficult to understand things, and there's actually a crisis of meaning in the world. Like we don't understand things anymore. The ruling classes don't understand the world anymore. We can see this, the incapacity to actually govern us and govern capitalism and deal with capitalist crisis. So I think that this authoritarian ideologies are a direct response to that, or a solution to that. And so what we did with this book is like to ask, okay, how can we counter this? How can we counter this kind of the effective or this emotional dimension of the authoritarian appeal? And this appeal is a very, very strong appeal. I mean, like this is for some reasons, we can talk about this later, but there is like the kind of, I don't know, promise or a kind of appeal in this radicalized conservative or sometimes even like fascist options. What happens there is like a combination of like classical far-right tropes, like racism, sexism, and so on, with like neoliberal elements, which is kind of like the newer part of it. And so in this book, which we can talk about later, and where Fido also published a wonderful article, we're trying to think about like more systematically, like how can we counter this? How can we reply to that?
Thank you so much, Boris. I forgot to say, but this PowerPoint that you are presenting here, it's a collective one. So instead of asking each of them to present a PowerPoint, we asked for them to send some photos, and then we prepared a collective PowerPoint. Because we learned from this book that collective sense of collectiveness is very important. But the person who mostly contributed with photos was Ekumen Selik. He coordinates the Coloniality Now initiative at the University of Freiburg. He's been an interim professor at the Institute for Sociology of the University of Freiburg and an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies. Yes.
Firstly, focus on your question about the rise of the right extremist movements and authoritarianism in general. I'm not a fan of the concept of authoritarianism in general, and identifying it directly with some countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Russia, China, Turkey, and so on. So I would suggest to focus more on the authoritarian practices. Why I suggest this? I mean, if we do it in a colonial way, then we say that no, it's not happening here. All these places are somewhere else, not in Europe. So in that sense, I would just simply say that let's focus on authoritarian practices and policies, which happens exactly here. So I'm not going to talk about AFD. I'm going to talk about just a couple of weeks ago, after a protest at the University of Berlin, inviting police to the campus, and later on the Ministry of Education and Research trying to punish the academics who signed the petition. I mean, that's the point. So this kind of attack on academic freedom has just happened in Germany. I'm a person who was the victim of that kind of attacks in Turkey. So I know it's a personal experience. I know what it means, but it's happening here. The second point is a huge hypocrisy in that sense. Hypocrisy, what I mean. I'm not worried about the rise of AFD. I'm worried about exactly what the others do. So these kind of things are happening in a liberal, under a liberal, green and social democratic government in Germany. Reformist new president in Iran, right? The European Union, Germany, German government supported President Erdogan in 2002 as a reformist, moderate Islamic leader. So, and I was fighting against even my PhD supervisor, who was in some committees of the Social Democratic Party and an old classmate of Schroeder at that time. So I just said, I mean, how can you think that this guy can be a reformist? So the third point, my third point, just to close, I mean, a month ago, Professor Arisitas gave an online lecture exactly in this department, in this building. Lecture was, are we losing our moral compass? Yes, we are losing our moral compass. So that's why we should ask democratic parties, are we losing our moral compass?
Thank you so much. And now let's hear Viviana Garcia Pinzon. She is a postdoc at the ABI. She is political scientist who has worked on how violence and governance intersect in mid-sized cities in Colombia and El Salvador, and now works on a decolonial perspective on care working protests, particularly in Cali, Colombia.
I really like the view Eugene started with, like challenging this idea that authoritarianism is something that we can ascribe to a particular political regime, because often in this discussion of this newness of the rise of the far right or the strengthening of authoritarianism, like it's often this portrayal that these phenomena are the result of the backsliding of liberal democracy. That's like we have more liberal democracy, so we have less authoritarian practices. And as you said, it's like authoritarian practices are actually part of these liberal democratic regimes. Having said that, however, I agree that we are clearly experiencing a trend of increasing democratic erosion, of de-democratization, as you said, and also more violence, right? And all this unfolds against the context of multiple global crises. The political regimes or political forms of authority are not able to cope with this crisis or to offer alternatives. So first, a first point to consider in the case of Latin America is that this kind of current authoritarian term develops against the backdrop of an ongoing political crisis of liberal democracy. In general, democracies in Latin America are perceived as inefficient, as they are not able to solve the problems of either security or economic or poor socioeconomic conditions of the population. So there is this high unsatisfaction with democracy, and this idea that in the frame of the third wave of democratization, there was this promise of democracy, but it has failed. And this against the background, right, of a region that has the highest levels of violence. And talking about direct violence, so this also something to consider. Second, we also have like the strengthening of these ultra-conservative groups and anti-rights movements, and these emerge as a backlash, right? Because also different countries in the region has experienced this expansion of rights against historically marginalized populations, and now we have this backlash, particularly against women and LGBTQ communities. And also there is this nationalistic and anti-globalist rhetoric, the growth of this kind of rhetoric. And finally, there is also this intensification of neoliberal values. And I think a good example of the combination of all these elements is the political project of El Salvador, and how Nayib Bukele has gained a lot of popularity, not only within El Salvador, but now we have like several politicians at the local level, at the national level, in several countries of the region that are promising like, hey, I am, your version of Bukele for this country. And this project builds on the dissatisfaction of Salvadorans with the democracy. Not only this dissatisfaction with liberal democracy, but also the dissatisfaction with this promise of liberal peace. It's good to remember that the transition in El Salvador was based in this peace agreement in 1992, and was considered like the flagship project of liberal peace at the moment, but clearly failed. So even Bukele says, okay, there is this idea, and it has been, like he has said, like there has not been democracy in El Salvador, so he tries to portray himself as the pathway to this kind of real democracy. Most of his government, particularly since 1922, has fought against a state of exception. Bukele recently started his second term, and all the time has been under a state of exception, with policies that are based not only in the suspension of the rule of law, but also massive incarceration, massive human rights violations, and also the reversing of several advances in terms of gender and justice and accountability. At the same time, I think that's interesting, Bukelismo, the project of Bukele, has no sparked efforts to position El Salvador as an ideal place for an investment, for the markets, and also it has been accompanied, has gone a long way, but a rhetoric that emphasizes neoliberal values and blames like the poor people of El Salvador for their conditions. It's like, the problem is not the system, the problem are not the structures, but rather that you are not doing enough. So I think El Salvador is a good example of somehow these continuities of authoritarian practices, but also these new elements. The fact that Bukele he said that he is very millennial dictator. But something that is quite paradoxical is that in the last iteration of the Latinobarometro, that is an opinion poll that is conducted in all countries in Latin America, El Salvador, for the first time, ranks as the country where population reports the highest levels of satisfaction with democracy. So we can see how El Salvador went from, completely unsatisfied, and now it's like, they love democracy. What democracy they love. And I think it speaks what you said, this authoritarian appeal, right? So how, in the face of this unsatisfaction with democracy and how political parties and all these traditional institutions are not delivering. So for people, this autocratic pathway is becoming more and more appealing. Parallel to these developments, also we can find all these resistance and counter-strategies. And just to mention very briefly my research, I have become very interested in all these kind of ordinary, more daily forms of resistance. How they go together with this more exceptional and eventful protests and demonstrations, but also how important are these kind of more subtle forms of daily resistance.
I think this brings us to the second question, connected to the title of this roundtable. Please, if you could say some words about what relations could you establish between authoritarianism and this theme of the coloniality of the city. How are these phenomena manifest in the everyday urban life, and mainly examples of resistance?
Thank you very much. I think it's very resonant with what you already talked about, Ian, about everyday life. So basically, if I want to explain what's happening in Iran in the past 2 years, I would say that it was struggles for life. Because what we face in the past decade in Iran is a very vicious, brutal way of polarization of life in very different aspect of life of people, from reproductive bodies, feminized bodies, also, but not also that, but destruction of nature in a very, very brutal way, but also further exploitations of all the resources that the country has. So basically, this is the colonization of life. But I think it is common all around the world. What we are facing in Iran. I would add that there is another way of colonization of life in Iran that is connected, of course, with others in everyday life, but it's about habitus in Iran, or kind of lifestyle in Iran that is really colonized because of the, Islamic fascism, and it is the way of governing and policing the bodies and territories in Iran. So basically, for example, dancing is something that we are deprived and we couldn't have in the country. And you can imagine how would be the situation when this transgressive body decided to kind of not obey this situation. So that's why I called also what's happening in Iran 2 years ago, the struggles for life. And I think it is important to connect in a way with other forms of struggles all around the world that has some common aspects, but definitely there is some unique dimensions, as I said, regarding the specific case of Iran. And when we talk about colonization of life, then everyday life is a train of and battleground of the basically change and the contestations. So it is in this sense very connected to the idea of the urbanity and urban life in everyday life of the urban places and networks. And in this sense, I would like to also raise the issues that the connection and the links between citizens in the big cities, at least, and cities change after Gene uprising in Iran, in a sense that for the first time after 1979 revolutions, there was a possibility of some neighborhood gathering initiative, the things that was kind of basically removed for more than 45 years in Iran. So the people at the local level finally found each other in that neighborhood initiatives to support each other. And it is related to the care politics that for me is a hallmark of the Gina uprising in Iran that's kind of unfolding in 2022, and the consequences and impact is still going on. So these decentered struggles really change, particularly among the youths, the connections and relation with the everyday life in neighborhoods. And I think it is very important. And one of the examples that I would like to mention is that some months ago, the municipality in Tehran decided to build a new big mosque in the middle of the the national park in Tehran. That is very important for the gathering of the people and for the, I come from exactly that neighborhood in Tehran. I grew up there. And that's, for the first time, this kind of idea of the planning a mosque, and this has a connotation, a religious connotation, of course, caused very, very interesting local mobilizations. And because it was related to the idea of the, environmental issues, but at the same time, urban life and also anti-religious fascism in Iran, government really afraid and scared, because everybody talking about this Gezi movement, because everybody said, oh, this is a potential to become another Gezi movement. And that's why it was very successful. So the memory of the past of something happened in other country, and the kind of returning to the neighborhood everyday life struggles caused that for the first time they were successful to at least push back the local government to not allow them to build this mosque so far. But we don't know what's happened next. But I think it's a good example of how the protests, Gina uprising, and also the memory of the other protests in the region has inspired and caused changing of the everyday life for a kind of rupture with the governments.
Anna, could you add some words as well?
Okay, I think I'm gonna just think out loud, and starting with the understanding like of the terminology of decolonial and decoloniality, because I think it does make a difference where we are and what we're speaking. So if I'm, and I do think, and I appreciate bringing up Germany, because as I tried to say before, also these like structures of oppression aren't just, we can't like recreate epistemic nationalism within our research and to recreate these nation state nationalisms, because that just doesn't make sense intellectually and practically, because both the oppression and the resistances that we have to form need to be connected. And at the same time, the kind of resistance that I will be able and want to practice is not exactly the same moving between a German university, a UK university, writing and thinking and speaking about these topics across at least 3 different languages and contexts. So we're constantly also translating strategies and the analysis of the same. And I think it's then important when we come to decolonial, because I don't really think that either in Germany or in Jordan and the wider region, there is really any decolonial movement. And at the same time, I'm really bored and annoyed with everybody using the word decolonial and then just not following up with any sort of practice. What use is the decolonial theorizing if then we can't actually at least speak up against the atrocities that are happening currently? So I'm very bored with German academia at this point, I have to say. And then to the terminology, so I mean, I researched in contexts that are at the moment predominantly Arabic speaking, not only in Jordan, but a lot in Jordan, and Jordan kind of sits in the middle of a lot of things geographically. Arabic doesn't actually have a word for decolonial. We do use taharruri, which means liberation. So all of the anti-colonial, decolonial, when people write about it in English or German and they say post-colonial, anti-colonial, decolonial, and so on, I always wonder, have you actually spoken to people that you're writing about? Because nobody would use this terminology. We would say taharruri, and freedom and liberation movements would be a more accurate translation. And I think it's important because it also shows that this liberation and freedom is also against those regimes that pretend to be post-colonial states, for example, in the situation of Jordan. So a liberation movement critiques the local Jordanian in this case, but it would also apply to a Lebanese or a Palestinian authority in the same way. So this kind of also talks to these transnational and imperial intimacies and connections. We can't have liberation in just one spot. It has to be bigger. And we have to see those connections on also how oppression basically comes home to roost and is proliferated. Like the way that currently academic freedom is basically being removed in Germany, if it ever existed in the first place, which, I mean, I have questions about that. This is because colonial and imperial strategies have been practiced elsewhere. The same kind of violences that we see on the rise in Europe is because Europe has been happily practicing this outside of Europe for the longest time. And then just to come then to this, it does change using the words like liberationist or freedom movements and activities in the city does change the way we look at it, because it is, and then, which means like, again, to take these moments seriously of what is being protested exactly. Just for example, in the city of Amman, I don't want to talk so much about like maybe just about how, for example, at this point in time, policing happens. So there are currently over 1,000 people imprisoned because they went on the streets protesting for Gaza just in the past couple of months. And we hear nothing about this in Germany because the people who are being imprisoned would also probably be at least harassed here. So what does this tell us about what kind of movements are being supported in the name of democracy? And where
Yes, thank you again. Marius, could you add also some words about this relation between authoritarianism and the urban issue, the urban dynamics?
Like thinking about this question of the connection between like authoritarianism, coloniality, and the urban, I like this concept of authoritarianism that Eva von Redeker has with the idea of phantom possession, and where she's saying that like basically authoritarianism or like authoritarian violence is kind of the entitlement over other subjects, no, like objectified subjects. Like there's a real, free, modern, liberal, mostly male, white, and so forth, subject, and the others, to which this free subject has an entitlement to rule over, to objectify it, no? Which of course has like a completely colonial dimension, no? She says like this kind of this propertized violence. You can think about the European border regime, you can think about racist violence and so on and so forth. Is kind of like a performance and a renewal of this differentiation and of this relation of ruling over objectified bodies, no? And so this just brings me to, I think, two ideas about the urban. One is, I think, it's important to remember that the urban does not end where the built city environment ends, but we have to think more in terms of urbanization. And this, for instance, for the Latin American context, I would say we have to think about conquista, or what has also been said about like accumulation by dispossession, or ursprüngliche Akkumulation, or whoever, like this violence of dispossession in the not necessarily urban world, but which is like the extraction of resources, which is the exploitation of territories and of bodies by capital, which is finance markets are concentrated in the capitalist centers, in the urban environments, in the spectrum, and then we know like the peripheric cities and the central cities and so on and so forth. No, but this is like something where I would say, okay, we have to think of this relation of accumulation by dispossession as an urban process.
Come back to a question, coloniality of the city. So in a country like South Africa, so they were the ones during apartheid, a racist regime, a segregated regime. They were the ones living in Bantustan, living in reservations, living in townships, and needed passports to enter the city. Yeah, so they were already excluded. And now, even in a democratic South Africa, the solution was taking that land from the Sheikh dwellers and pushing them away again to the periphery of the city. So 20 kilometers, 40 kilometers away, offering them some like easy built houses and whatever. But that's the coloniality of the situation. They are the same people. I mean, the black South Africans and usually the poor Indian communities. So the city still does not belong to them.
What about the relationship between the coloniality and the city? I think definitely we cannot understand urbanization without thinking or considering colonialism. And it applies both for colonial powers as well as for colonized territories. First, I am from Colombia, but I am from Bogota, that is the capital city. And Cali is a city located in the southwest of the country, close to the Pacific Ocean. After Rio de Janeiro is the city in Latin America with the highest percentage of Black population. So in 2021, Colombia experienced a wave of protests. It has been like the biggest one in the last decades. It is estimated that around 1.5 million people went to the streets in different cities of Colombia, in different places. And they protest not only against the government, but also like against different structural problems. But Cali was like the most important place for this protest. And something that was quite interesting is that this protest was not only like people going to the streets one day and stopping and coming back to the streets the next day, but they somehow occupied the streets, and they established something that in the city was called points of resistance, puntos de resistencia, and they basically like really closed the streets. And some of these places were there like for almost 3 or 4 months. And there were around 28 of these spaces in the city. The response of the state was extremely violent. It was like a place of urban warfare against the people participating in this protest. And it's quite interesting to see how these protests disrupted the spatiality of the city, challenged all these colonial hierarchies. It was not that they only disrupted the normal rhythms of the city, but how in these spaces they tried to create a new city, like with new practices, and to not only to imagine, but to live, like according to this alternative way. For me, for instance, in one of the interviews that I conducted there, a young man told me that for him, it was the first time where he could like experience what was to have a communal life. That for the first time he had the opportunity just to sit down with people, like hang out with them, talk with them, cook together, I don't know, do artistic things, learn different things. He said, because all my life I had been always struggling to survive. Just to give you an example that how this protest is not only about like protesting against something, but also how there are also spaces to create alternatives and to somehow like make them possible.